Joy's Way by Dr. Brugh Joy. Chapter 6, Part 2. Occasionally, a few people bump into so-called entities, fields of force, that make their presence known through the movement of objects, such as the poltergeist phenomenon, through possession, through spontaneous combustion of materials, or through channeling during trance or meditation of what seems to be conscious entities. If your belief system discounts all such phenomena, you are simply using a convenient way to deal with what is incomprehensible to you. I am impelled to share my own experiences and concepts because this area of exploration is profoundly interesting, and as expanded awareness begins to be experienced, these phenomena are encountered and must be dealt with. Wait until you experience them. It is in anticipation of that time that I share this information. What I want to do is offset some of the crazy ideas people have about these manifestations. I was in my late 20s when such an experience first happened to me. A poltergeist manifestation appeared one evening while I was working on a scientific paper that I was to present to the staff of the Mayo Clinic. I was in the living room of my small second-story apartment in Rochester, Minnesota, minding my own business, when the hair on the back of my neck suddenly stood straight up. I sensed at once that there was something in the room, but I couldn't see it. Then objects on the kitchen table flew to the floor. A set of keys on top of the refrigerator catapulted across the room. At this point, I could see the vague shape of a vortex of energy moving on the other side of the room. I was so scared that I actually lost control of my bowel and bladder. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I was going to have a coronary. If the vortex came any closer to me, I felt I might die. Fortunately, there was a phone on the desk. Keeping my eye on the vortex, I carefully picked up the receiver and dialed my mother in Garden Grove, California. I misdialed several times because I refused to let whatever it was out of my sight. My mother finally answered the phone, much to my relief. I whispered that there was something in my apartment that wasn't human and felt malevolent. After I told her the events as they had transpired, I was shocked by her response. "Nonsense," she said. "It's only a poltergeist, dear. It won't hurt you if you don't fear it." She sounded almost lighthearted as she said it. "Tell it to go away. Say that it has no business there. Tell it to go back where it came from." I felt a calm come over me. Then anger. I put the receiver down on the desk, got up, and went over to the old whatever it was, and I yelled out, "Get out!" Much to my amazement, it did. Mother laughed when I returned to the phone. "Something in you attracted it," she said. "It's time to see what thoughts inside you attracted it." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but by then it didn't make any difference to me. The thing was gone, and that was all that mattered. The broken dishes and the keys flying across the room, these were not my imagination, nor had I been placing my mind in a suggestible state by reading a ghost story. I was hard at work on a thesis covering a disease related to the pancreas. Even if this event should prove to have been caused by an energy from my own beingness, it would be awesome. But my feeling was that it had some external energy that responded to my telling it to leave. Several years later, Eunice, during my time of study with her, emphasized the differentiation between thought forms and essences. I, however, paid very little attention to this aspect of her work, because to me entities, whether their form was human or demonic, were nothing more than projections of people's minds, except for my poltergeist experience, which I had by then rationalized as being some natural form of energy vortex, not well understood by science. Nothing in my experience had made me concern myself with the distinctions between thought forms and other supernatural beings, or to pay much attention to Eunice's teaching on protection and shielding. I can remember her saying that the great deceivers were to be encountered when one entered the subtle levels of awareness. She talked about their presence in the room when she was teaching and about the differences in the kinds of light that emanated from them. The true spiritual beings of high development have a full aura, she said. They are filled with a particular quality of white, clear light. Discarnate souls, these are ordinary people who have died, appear as they did in life, their auric development easy to discern. Thought forms, creatures, and forms similar to the human as well as the demonic are in darker shades. Salute the divinity in them. If they are spiritual beings, they will respond. If they don't, send them on their way. Since I couldn't see any of these entities or even feel their presence, I would just sit and wait until she discussed areas of more interest to me, such as healing. In September 1975, I woke one night feeling a powerful presence in my room at the ranch. Its form was human. Its color is dark. Its feeling demonic. Remembering what my mother and Eunice had said about such things, I simply told it to leave. And it did. The next morning in meditation, I asked my inner teacher about the presence that had entered my room the night before, and the inner teacher delivered a long discourse, of which I remember the essentials. Just as a man is conceived and created out of a higher order of intelligence, so too can man create out of his own order and intelligence. Each time an individual images a person is in his or her mind, a subtle form of the imaged person is created. Its level of manifestation is ordinarily different from the levels with which we are commonly familiar, but people who are highly developed in the art of thought form creation can empower their thought forms with enough subtle energy to materialize them. The old-time Tibetans, who were masters of this technique, created many thought forms in the configuration of demons and used them to frighten off unaware humans who might covet things the Tibetans wanted guarded. These thought form demons were like household pets. They were often sent out on certain missions, or like watchdogs to ward off enemies. The more demonic-looking the thought form, the more effective it was. But thought forms aren't restricted to the demonic. To the demonic thought forms of saints. Let me start that sentence again. But thought forms aren't restricted to the demonic. Thought forms of saints, Buddha, Christ, wise teachers, angels, gods, animals, and so on are all manifested in what we call the astral plane by this mechanism. Once they are created, they remain manifest until a human consciousness dissolves them. If the human who creates them dies, the thought forms he or she created remain. From prehistoric times up to the present moment, the human mind has created thought forms for thousands and thousands of years, so that the astral plane is a vast cesspool of these creations, most generated by human consciousness. The moment human consciousness images a thought form is created. Most of them, the products of average human minds, have so little substance or intensity as to be of no real consequence. Some, however, are so strong that they can be seen and heard by clairvoyants and other sensitives, and if a thought form is created by many people, it is apt to be very powerful. An outstanding and familiar example of this is the thought form of Christ. Millions of people imaging the Christ figure have created millions of thought forms of Christ and have empowered them with all the attributes that human consciousness believes necessary to such a figure. Because of these millions of repetitions, the Christ thought form is a powerful one, and it appears to many sensitives. Just as we are not consciously aware that we are the creations of a higher order of intelligence, so thought forms do not know that they are thought forms, nor usually do psychics who channel them. it is critical to distinguish between the thought form of Jesus Christ, the actual Jesus Christ, and the essence of Christ. While the actual Christ exists as a single essence, the Christ thought form exists in unbelievable numbers. The actual Christ essence is not created by the human level of consciousness, but all the others are. In all but rare exceptions, psychics do not bring in the Christ essence. They bring in the thought forms of Christ. All thought forms are created by the human mind and may be dissolved by the human mind. But what the human mind did not create cannot be dissolved by it. This difference can be the key to telling them apart. The inner teacher told me that the entity that had come to me the night before was a thought form that I had created in a previous lifetime. I then asked the inner teacher, "How do I know that you are not a thought form of mine or someone else's?" It replied simply, "Try to dissolve me." I couldn't, and to tell the truth, I didn't especially want to. The next evening, the same negative entity appeared in my room again. It wouldn't leave immediately, and it kept me awake. I felt fear because it was very demonic. Over the next few weeks, it returned every few nights. Finally, in great anger and with great force that I had never felt pass through my body before, I arose from my bed and I bellowed an invocation. "I created you, and I now dissolve you." The demon disappeared and never returned. People who find themselves doing automatic writing are sometimes channeling thought forms. I know of 5 different people who believed that they channeled the Christ. Of the 5, only 2 are at the level of metaphysical training to be able to distinguish thought form from essence. In such a case, a reading of the material brought through often gives a good idea of whether it's a thought form or whether it's an essence. Several months ago, a Gestalt therapist shared with me an interesting phenomenon he had observed when he was working in Brazil. The poorer classes of people there are involved with cults, dealing either with black magic, the majority of them, or with white magic. They talk about supernatural entities, demons, good entities, and so on. The middle and upper classes who hire the poor as servants consider such talk sheer superstition and pay little attention to it. Working with a group of middle and upper class people in techniques to raise their awareness into transformational states, my therapist friend found to his amazement that they were becoming sensitive to thought forms, and they began to report encounters with the thought forms created by their employees. The therapist himself had an encounter with some form of energy that pushed him to the ground and forced his head back by pulling his hair. The lesson here is that disbelief in thought forms seems to have a protective or shielding effect, but only so long as people stay away from explorations of subtle reality. If they begin to lose their disbelief, they are unprotected unless they go on through the experience to the start of understanding. It is a difficult subject, to say the least. What I have said may not be much, but I hope it will be enough to help a beginner should the need arise. And that's the end of that section. And I'm just going to say a few words that might help you. Okay. When I first read this chapter, I don't know, it was about 15 years ago or something like that. And I thought it was very interesting. And I don't know how much time passed between my reading it and my experience. Because, I mean, who pays attention, right, to the time element? But I remember one night I was in my bedroom and I was just puttering around. I wasn't doing anything particularly spiritual or, like Dr. Brugh, I really wasn't doing anything. But suddenly I did have this feeling like the hairs on the back of my head stood up. I just had this awful sensation, and I tried to pinpoint where the energy was coming from, and it was coming from one specific area of the room. It was a rather large room, and it was one particular area of the room, and I looked at the area and I tried to see if there was anything to be seen there, except, but I was scared. I was almost paralyzed with fear. Like, it was so strong, the negative energy coming from that corner of the room. It was a little, a little alcott of the room, a little nook, let's say. And I'd never felt anything like that before. And as this occurred, I don't know why, but immediately the thought of this book came into my awareness, and I remembered, what he had said. And without hesitation, I shouted at that thought form or entity or whatever it was to leave. I mean, in no uncertain terms, I just full force on, and I'm not a person who shouts, but yes, I was not having it. And luckily, it disappeared. I mean, right away after I did that, it was like, it was gone. And I knew it was gone. I mean, the energy in the room didn't feel the same. I felt good about being there. I felt such relief. And it was powerful. So I'm just saying, pay attention. If this happens to you, use it. It actually works, right? Now, one other thing I'd like to say is, because while we're on the topic and everything, I do teach. I teach various spiritual aspects of living. And because I teach spiritual healing and I teach hypnotherapy and I do various things. One of the things that I teach is shielding. And maybe you've heard of shielding, and there are many ways to shield. And I'm not saying the way I shield is the right way or anything like that. I did not shield before this happened to me, but sometimes when I think I'm going to go into a situation that might require shielding, I do shield before going into this situation. Sometimes I'll get as far as my car, I'll sit down in my car, and I'll shield before I leave, to go wherever I'm going. And when I come home after the event, I collapse the shield, and I'm back to normal. And, when I first learned about shielding, I'll just tell you, when I first learned about it, it was from a spiritual teacher whom I studied with for 5 years. And she was quite an amazing woman. And she taught us this technique. And like I say, it's not the only technique or anything. But I thought, it didn't seem very useful to me. Where was I going to use it? And, And then a while later, something came up, and I thought, how did that work again? And I tried it. And you know what? It works. It actually works. So, if you'd like me to do an audio about shielding and include the instructions maybe under the audio or something, so you can print them out and just have them. And I'm not saying that this is the only way, the way I do it, but it is effective. And try it, see if it resonates with you. Really, it's been a godsend to me, and reading this book, Joy's Way. Whoa. Yeah. Anyhow, so continuing now. This is continuing with the book now, okay? Chapter 6, Part 2. Of all the quantum leaps, the resolution of the death space is the most difficult to experience. As we saw in Chapter 1, the concept of death is not only encrusted with an overwhelming load of fears, myths, fantasy, ignorance, and neurotic ideation, but also in the West, it is as much as possible shrouded and concealed from experience. Either physical or psychological death is a transformational experience. And then in brackets he says, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross put the idea well in the title of her book. death the final stage of growth. No soul that is ever manifested in this plane has escaped it. Nor is it desirable that we should. From the perspective of the awakened mind, death is such an awesome specter as to be quickly suppressed or to be discussed in tones that are deadly serious. We may joke about death, but the psycho-emotional reaction to the actual event, whether the death of loved ones or the knowledge of one's approach to one's own death, is probably the most profound experience ordinary consciousness must meet. The end of the physical life, or the threatened end of the psychological life, is one of the central fears of the human being. It demonstrates our usual identification of the aware state of consciousness with the outer manifestation plane and the body and the ego and the personality level. When one is able to break free of this identification, when one knows experientially that body and ego are not the sole totality of one's beingness, the transformational state of consciousness can become available while one is still embodied. It took me a long time to catch a glimpse of a higher self beyond the ego self. I had plenty of ideas about such a self, but I had no real experience of it until I committed myself to the de-identification with the ego, to embrace what I call the higher orchestrator. I spent 9 months working on the death process in terms of the ego or ideas about myself. During that time, I became aware that I would have to de-identify with my body. In other words, the fear of physical death and psychological death would have to be released, and the only way I knew to do it was to trust my beingness was more than either my body or my ego. That trust was based on rare and brief experiences through meditation. Please note carefully that I'm not speaking about destroying the physical form or the ego. I am speaking about the expansion into a state of awareness where the loss of either is of no importance. This state of immortality, and it has absolutely no concept of death. No, this state is immortality, and it has absolutely no concept of death. Literally, it does not know that death exists because deathless itself, it experiences bodies and personalities only as vehicles to express itself. It is the outer mind that creates the pain surrounding death, because death itself is only a marker, a gate that signals to the deeper awareness that a lifetime is now complete. Because of the continuity of beingness, the deep awareness does not even experience the actual moment of death. I have enjoyed Edgar Cayce's comments on this subject. He said in one of his readings that if only the outer awareness knew the fear and apprehension of the soul just before incarnating into the plane, there would be far less fear about passing out of it. The greatest psychological pain of the death process is caused by the attachment to the form nature, whether it be to other people, to one's own body, places, whatever. To conquer this pain, the fear associated with it, detachment must be achieved. To psychologists and psychiatrists, detachment is a symptom of an abnormal state of consciousness. If the detachment is complete, it is called a psychotic break, a loss of connection with reality. I want to emphasize clearly that I am not discussing a state of consciousness that is disconnected from reality. I am discussing a state of consciousness that is aware of ordinary reality, but is also aware of an even higher portion of beingness. In this state, one does not overvalue either the ego or the body, because neither is essential to the existence of the higher consciousness. A psychotic break is, however, a genuine risk in the practice of detachment, unless one has had at least a thin thread to guide the awareness of the higher levels, the mind can lose itself in universes that have no connection at all to the outer reality. There is a slight risk on the return to the usual perspective of outer reality, but it is nothing in comparison to the risk involved in releasing ego boundaries to embrace the higher self. This risk is especially great if one has a tendency to reject either the self or the outer reality. Detachment and rejection lead to quite different consequences. While detachment has the potential of enlightenment, rejection has the potential of neuroses, of psychosis, of death of the physical body, or all three. Detachment produces the serenity of releasing to embrace, while rejection produces anguish, pain, and let me out of here feelings. As a preparation for this detachment without rejection, contemplation on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of the Dead can be extremely helpful. They can also be terribly confusing if one doesn't catch the essentials. In the process of detachment come 56 demons, and each one of them represents individual or collective fears that can deflect the soul from the straight path and completely block its progress, if the awareness gives them even the slightest acknowledgement. The 56 demons must simply be ignored. I reached the culmination of my work on the process of psychological death with my experience in the Great Pyramid of Cheops. Before I relate the experience, I will explain how I managed to arrange to spend a night alone in the Great Pyramid. I went to Egypt from Findhorn. I'm thinking here, maybe I should pause. No, I'll continue. I'll continue to the end because it's not that much further. Okay. I went to Egypt from Findhorn with two wonderful friends, David Elliott and Pat McLean. I had 3 objectives in mind. One was to scan the mummies in the Cairo Museum. I'll discuss scanning in the next chapter. Another was to visit the Karnak ruins. The last was to spend a night alone in the Great Pyramid. On arriving in Cairo, we headed straight to the pyramid and took the usual guided tour through it. It was amazing to me because while the pyramid is huge, the passageways up to the Grand Gallery and into the Queen's and King's chambers are so small that one can only crawl or waddle to get through to them. On entering the Grand Gallery, one has to climb a series of steel rungs to reach a walkway that, in turn, ascends to the entrance of the King's chamber. Some major drop-offs have no railing for protection. On the guided tour, I made a mental map of the pyramid in preparation for my solitary adventure. Outside the pyramid, one of the tour guides asked whether I wanted to spend some time alone inside. From stories I had heard, I guessed it was going to cost me some money to make arrangements, so I went to work on my best business and bartering states of consciousness. I might be interested, I said, but it would have to be for the entire night of the full moon, 2 days away, and I needed to be entirely alone. This is very difficult, the guide responded, and I began to see the dollar signs go up in brilliant neon, rising higher and higher into the sky. I agreed to meet him the next day for a report on his progress in getting me in. Since it was early afternoon, Pat, David, and I decided to climb to the top of the pyramid to meditate on the setting sun. Our plan was to assault the top by going straight up the north face. About a third of the way up, I realized it was a crazy thing to do. The face of the pyramid had been eroded by centuries of wind-driven sand, so that handfuls and footholds could break off at a touch. It didn't seem to bother David, who had nearly reached the top. I experienced several minutes of panic. I was about 200 feet up, and I wasn't really sure I could get down. When I looked down, there were all these people screaming up at me in Arabic. When I did get down, an Arab who spoke English told me that the way I'd been going was the most difficult way to climb the pyramid, and that, in fact, at least 9 people a year are killed trying it. "I'll show you the way," he said. It didn't cost as much as I thought it would. The pyramid is more than 450 feet high, with an angle incline of 51 degrees, 51 seconds. The corner edges are huge blocks, like giant steps, and so I climbed upon them until I was about 2/3 of the way up. At that point, I was startled by a tremendously powerful urge to cast myself off. Never in my life had I experienced such an impulse. Instead of lessening, it intensified as I continued upward, and I had to use every last degree of control not to jump. The moment I reached the apex, however, the feeling dissipated. The experience was eerie, almost as if there was some sort of barrier or force field one had to pass through. Later, I climbed the pyramid several times without sensing the barrier field, but that first blast was almost too much for me. The next day, the guide informed me that it would not be possible to stay in the pyramid overnight. More money, I thought. Finally, I politely asked him who was in charge of the pyramid. "A professor of Egyptian antiquities over there," he said, pointing to some sand dunes. "I'll talk to him," I replied. So I went over the sand dunes and I found the small adobe-like structure with its office and encountered the official, a young man who spoke excellent English and was shrewd. When I told him I'd like to spend some time alone in the pyramid, he seemed perfectly agreeable and offered to arrange for a 3-hour period late that afternoon, after the pyramid was closed to the public. When I told him I wanted to spend the entire night alone inside the pyramid, his attitude changed. Before I realized what was happening, I found myself undergoing another psychiatric interview, one of several I endured in 1975. I convinced him I was sane and that my motives were coherent. I was deliberately a little misleading. How could I tell him that I was working on the death process and detachment? He informed me that only the president of Egypt could give permission for me to stay in the pyramid for the entire night. What the young official could arrange was for me to be inside from 5 to 8 that evening, after the pyramid had closed to the public, and again from 5 to 8 in the morning before it opened. I immediately saw how I was going to spend the whole night in the pyramid, and I asked him if I could accept his offer of time alone in the pyramid for the next evening. He agreed, but he also delivered a warning about a long stay in the pyramids. Too many people become psychotic if they spend more than just a few hours at a time in there. That was the last thing he said to me. Promptly at 5 p.m. on the night of the full moon, February 1975, I met the gatekeeper who was to let me in and take me out at the appropriate time. A payment of 15 Egyptian pounds to the gatekeeper enabled him to forget to let me out that evening. The gate was locked behind me as I began my penetration to the first inclined tunnel. It was dark and cool, 5:10 p.m., full moon. When I entered the pyramid to spend the night, I was free to release the world, my form, and my ego. I had already detached myself from everything and everyone else. The most difficult detachment for me to achieve had been from my 2 brothers, especially my twin. One would have thought it would be my mother or my father, but it wasn't. The release of my twin brother had been almost unbearable. It had taken place an hour earlier in a meditation between the paws of the Sphinx. I felt fear of psychosis, but only momentarily. I was aware of something else inside me, guiding this initiation, as if I had experienced it all before in other lifetimes, an Egyptian lifetime, a Tibetan lifetime, a Zen Buddhist lifetime, and a Christian monk lifetime. Even the demonic thought forms that greeted me on my entrance turned out to be old, familiar, almost friendly experiences. I was not, however, in such a state of consciousness as to be entirely free from my childhood memories of such horror movies as The Mummy's Curse and its sequel, The Return of the Mummy. As I said earlier, the usual work with thought forms is merely to ignore demons. But there was also another effective maneuver, to laugh at them. Laughter turned out to be the most effective way to dispel them. When the demons disappeared, I felt a tremendous sense of freedom. Now I had access not only to the deepest aspects of the pyramid, but to the deepest aspects of my own beingness as well. My eyelids seemed like cellophane, because I could not tell whether my eyes were open or closed. When I paused before the entrance to the first small passage, I began to notice a light that seemed to touch my body and to extend for several feet. At first I suspected I might be hallucinating, but as I inched my way along the walls, what I felt with my hands correlated to what I was seeing. My ego boundaries were dissolving, and the pyramid and I were fusing into a unit. I spent almost 3 hours in the Queen's chamber, and then ascended to the King's chamber for 9 hours of experiences beyond my ability to articulate, even today. After 12 hours, the process of detachment and expansion ended. I had died in those 12 hours. Whatever configured my consciousness as William Brugh Joy, M.D., was gone. I was an incarnation of another aspect of my beingness in the same physical vehicle. It would take several years for it to mature, but my consciousness had been fully impregnated with information, and I had completed the experience of entering states of awareness I had not even dreamed of. I was ready to begin the journey back down. I reached the opening of the pyramid at 6:10, the approach of sunrise. As if by magic, the gatekeeper appeared and unlocked the gate. I felt something even greater than exhilaration. It was Ananda. I climbed the pyramid to experience the sunrise and the full moon set. It was rebirth. My encounter with inner death was completed, but my outer death work was not. In Auroville, India, a month after my night in the Great Pyramid, I suddenly decided to return to the United States. The outer reason was my desire to complete the ceremony of becoming a fellow for the American College of Physicians. I could have chosen to do it the following year, and I was experiencing an almost incredible state of integration and well-beingness in India. But the pull back to the United States was the force that determined my action then. After I was confirmed a fellow in San Francisco on April 7, 1975, I traveled down the coast of California. I took a side trip to the desert to spend a few days at the ranch, and I reached Los Angeles on the morning of the 17th of April. I was visiting a friend when Father telephoned. My mother, who had previously enjoyed perfect health, had collapsed. The rescue squad was attempting cardiac resuscitation. I went into deep meditation, and my mother spoke to me, and she said she was going to die but would not leave her body until I was with her at the hospital, 45 minutes away. In the emergency room, I talked briefly with the physician in charge. She is stable, but comatose, he said. I pulled back the white curtain that surrounded her. She was on a respirator and 2 IVs were running. Electrocardiographic electrodes were on her arms, on her left leg, and over her heart. The monitor showed the heart to be regular in rhythm, but acutely injured. I scanned her energy field quickly, and then went to the heart area and began to transfer energy to her. It was like a steel wall. Not one speck of energy would move into her body. I went to the head area and I tried again. Again, there was no transfer of energy. Her eyes were dilated. She was serene and strikingly beautiful, like a Nefertiti. Nefertiti? 5 minutes after I had arrived, her heart stopped. No medication, no countershock. Excuse me. Nothing could stimulate it into activity. She was gone. I removed her wedding ring, and I turned to cry. The nurse who was working beside me held me for a few moments of pain and tears as the physical bonding between mother and son was broken. And Chapter 7, the title is Command Therapy, the Chakras, Body Scanning, Energy Transfer, Healing.